Okay. So when it comes to actually applying for financial aid, as I understand it, there are two different forms that families might be asked to fill out, the FAFSA or the CSS. Can you talk a little bit about those two?
That's right. Yeah, the FAFSA is the main financial aid application that was designed by the U.S. Department of Education. Every single college in the U.S. requires the FAFSA form. And then there are about 200 almost entirely private colleges that don't think the FAFSA provides them with enough information and require this additional form called the CSS or the profile. The CSS profile is the full name, where it digs a little bit deeper into the family's financial situation. So every college is going to ask for at least the FAFSA. About 200 will ask for that additional form, the profile. For divorced families in particular, the big difference between the two forms is that the FAFSA only requires information from what they call the custodial parent, and that actually doesn't matter what any actual custody agreement says. And for FAFSA purposes, the custodial parent is the parent who the student lives with greater than 50% of the time. Again, regardless of what any custody agreement says. If the student lives with each parent exactly equally, the tiebreaker factor is what parent provides greater financial support. That is the custodial parent for FAFSA purposes. The non-custodial parent is, at least up front, invisible on the FAFSA. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Their finances are invisible on the FAFSA. But at the schools that require the CSS profile, most of them require both custodial and non-custodial parent information. So you can see for divorced families, they could see vastly different financial aid offers depending on whether their child is applying to a FAFSA-only school that just looks at the custodial parent's finances. And by the way, any step parents in the household, it's the entire custodial household, as opposed to if the student is applying to CSS profile schools that are going to look at both households information, both parents, potentially any step parents, and everyone's finances are getting considered at a profile school. So for families where that's going to make a big difference, where the non-custodial parent may make significantly more income than the custodial parent, and it's going to make a big difference to financial aid, they may want to focus their college search more on FAFSA-only schools that are not going to look at the custodial parent.
Okay, so that's one great strategy. Let's talk again. You mentioned step parents for a moment there, and I want to go back to that. So on the FAFSA, step parents are included or not included?
They are. If it's the step parent in that custodial household, the person that is married to the custodial parent, their finances are in fact looked at on the FAFSA. So it is the income and assets of that entire custodial household, which could be the parent, the biological parent, or the adoptive parent, plus the step parent, whoever they're married to. That is the case on the FAFSA.
Okay, but if they're cohabiting and not married, the second income in that household is not included?
That is correct. At a FAFSA-only school, that second income is not included. So it's definitely something for parents considering remarriage to think about. Introducing another income to the financial aid equation can make a big difference in financial aid eligibility. And I used to see it all the time when I was working in a financial aid office, and a student would I used to work at Boston University and Tufts University, and students might come in as a freshman with a great financial aid package, and then during freshman year their custodial parent gets remarried, and all of a sudden all of that aid disappears for future years, because now if step parent has a great big income, that is now feeding into the financial aid calculation. So those remarriage decisions for parents of college age students, they really have to think carefully and understand the financial aid implications.
Wow. And I guess from a family law perspective, that might trigger the sort of change that might trigger another modification as between the parents, because it would significantly change the amount of that each parent was expected to contribute to college. So you might also find yourself with more litigation in that
Yes.
scenario. So
yes, so lots of difficulties. Yeah.
an important strategy to keep in the back of your mind then, if find yourself in that situation.
Yes.
What about child support? How is that treated on the FAFSA?
Child support is looked at as untaxed income of the parent. So the parent, the custodial parent on the FAFSA is reporting their income. The biggest number that generally appears there is their adjusted gross income. That's the biggest number, typically feeding into the financial aid calculations. But then the FAFSA also asks about a number of forms of untaxed income that the parent may have received. And included in the list of various forms of untaxed income that they ask about is, in fact, child support. So child support does inflate the custodial parent's income for financial aid purposes. One thing that sometimes comes up in my conversations is if that child support is going to end at some point while the child is in college, it's something to bring up to the financial aid office that, yes, you're reporting income from a couple years back on your FAFSA and you may have received child support then, but if that amount is going to decrease or disappear when the child is actually enrolled in college, that's something to bring up to the financial aid office. And they can take that into account, remove potentially the child support from the calculations if it's not going to be received in future years.